Okay, so Bashar has said many times that all suffering and all dis-ease is the result of resistance to the natural self. But why would there be any resistance to the natural self to begin with? We're going to talk about this and also what it means to surrender and what resistance truly is and how you can surrender it and get rid of it in this video. So I've talked in previous videos about the core issues and how the core separation is created. I'm going to repeat myself a little bit briefly here to get the correct context. So basically you're born into this world as a wide open baby, and at some point very early on the wide openness is going to shut down or get closed up or contract because of the massive amount of negativity in the mass consciousness and what you pick up from your parents and the surroundings. So this creates a false Santa close to the core of your true Santa, which is the natural self. And this false Santa becomes, or it's more correct to say it's an inauthentic or artificial Santa. It's an artificial construct that becomes the core of the personality, which is also an artificial construct. And this artificial original separation or original contraction is basically what you can call the inner Antichrist or the inner Lucifer, because it's the ultimate resistance. It says no to life on a very fundamental level because of the pain and suffering that surrounds the baby in the form of negativity from the mass consciousness and from the parents, and also obviously if the parents are abusive, even well-meaning abuse like hitting a child on these things, Wherever it is, it adds to this core separation and becomes the core, the artificial core of this artificial personality. So this is the original sin, you might call it that. It's the best way to refer to a sin in that way, because there is no real sin in reality, but this original sin or original separation is what creates the ultimate inner resistance that is at the core of your being or the core of your personality structure. And everything else is built upon that inner resistance against life and God and the soul and everything. So this inner Antichrist becomes the foundation of your whole personality structure, which obviously, if the foundation is basically pure resistance, then everything built upon it naturally also becomes resistance, just different degrees. So you have a whole artificial construct that becomes like a straitjacket surrounding your natural self and preventing the natural self from expressing itself like it would naturally. And enlightenment is basically finding back to the natural self by deconstructing the artificial straitjacket of the personality construct. And then the natural self can emerge and express itself in physical reality as an expression of the higher mind in physical 3D reality. But as for most people, they haven't reached that level. They will still have the straitjacket on in different degrees, in different forms, and all these different various ways that can be expressed based on according to the level of consciousness on the scale. So as you create this inner wounding at a very early stage in your life, which becomes the false Santa or the inauthentic or the artificial center of your personality structure, you basically kind of run away from that core wounding when you grow up. So you run away down the scale kind of, because you want to get away from feeling worthless, which is basically how the very center of the personality feels. It feels completely worthless and powerless. And that's why it's filled with rage. And it hates life, it hates God, it hates you, it hates everything basically. And it wants to destroy and ruin everything. That's basically the core of the personality, or the core issues of separation. And obviously there are degrees. Some people will have a lot more of this, a lot worse than others. But anyway, if you have some kind of serious core issues, like I had, for example, which is not even serious compared to many people, but still, then you will find yourself running away from that wounding as you grow up, and you will suddenly, or not suddenly, but gradually, you will end up towards the bottom of the scale of consciousness. This obviously also has to do with, the mass consciousness you grow up in, and also all your surroundings as you grow up, but basically you're running away from the feeling of worthlessness. But that takes you only down the scale of consciousness until you actually understand that you have to do work on yourself to get back somehow to your true center. And that's when a turning point happens in your life, usually young adulthood, but it can happen later too. And then you sort of start the spiritual journey up or back towards your true center again, the natural self. So that's why the personality is like a straitjacket, because it forces you kind of to behave and think and act in certain ways that are not really free. You're not really a free person. You feel constrained, restricted by this straitjacket, which creates all the suffering, because all the resistance to the natural self who just wants to express itself naturally. And it has all these resistances that the personality is filled with, the subconscious is filled with, built on top of the ultimate original resistance, which is the core issues, or the core separation. So that's pretty much what is meant by resistance. It's not just one thing, it's a whole artificial construct. And there are basically everything that you hold on to, that you have picked up in this world, is on some level it's negative. It's not all the baggage you pick up, even belief systems that are pretty high level, like in the 400s, they still carry a weight. They're still negative compared to the complete freedom of the core of the self, of the true self, of the natural self. And everything that's picked up in this world from parents and surroundings, you will have to let go of at some point if you want to find back to your true center. And it's just a question of quality and, heaviness of these different beliefs and the energies that they create, the emotions that they create in the subconscious and the, semi-conscious mind. But they're all basically negative, and there is nothing you need to hold on to in that sense, because when you let go of anything, it's usually replaced by knowingness, because you're basically letting go of part of the straitjacket, and then the natural self has a bit more freedom to express itself, and the natural self is already in complete knowingness anyway. So it doesn't need artificial beliefs or spirituality or any kind of beliefs to function like it would, because it already knows how to do that. But it's trapped inside a very complex straitjacket of a personality. So the whole idea about letting go of resistance is basically just a deconstruction of this straitjacket, this personality artificial construct. And that is done layer by layer. And that, these layers basically consist of all sorts of resistances. And then you will have that reflected back to you. These unconscious beliefs will be reflected back to you by the surroundings. because your higher mind will put you in situations where that happens. And then you can choose to be angry about it and resist, like many people do for their whole life. Or you can choose to work with the higher mind and the situation and use reality as the mirror to reflect it back and to get conscious of these beliefs you hold on to or resistances, and then let go of them one by one, kind of, and layer by layer, and then you increase your level of consciousness, and you find you get closer and closer to your natural self again, to freedom. And then at some point you will have to face the actual core issues, if you have any. You can just have the default core issues, which is just a separation, but you don't have like any abuse or trauma from the parents or from your childhood, no real issues like that. And you might not have to face a really hard dark night of the soul like I had to for 10 years or something like that. But that depends on your core issues, if you have actual trauma, or if you just have the default trauma, you could say, of growing up in a very negative mass consciousness with negativity from people around you, but without any real abuse. It all depends. But at some point, when you have reached the 500s and the higher 500s on the scale, unconditional love, you will have to go through a dark night of the soul, which is facing off against the inner Antichrist, inner Lucifer. And that can be rough, but it depends. For me, it was pretty rough. I talk about this in different videos. But it's important to take away from this that, many teachers, they just say you need to surrender, but that sounds very easy, but surrendering is a full-time job, 24/7, basically your whole life, until you actually get enlightened. And then you're in a constant state of surrender, you might say. And even in enlightenment, there are different levels of enlightenment. You still have to go through very subtle surrendering if you want to reach the absolutely highest level, which is 1000 or 0 on this scale, because this scale is reversed. But anyway, so the essence of surrender is basically just letting go of baggage that you carry that creates the straitjacket prison of your own device that you're trapped inside, or the natural self is trapped inside. And that's the whole spiritual journey. So there's no mystery to it, because you're surrendering to get more of your natural self free and become closer to your natural self again, and then eventually becoming the natural self. That's pretty much how it works, and there's nothing more to learn or understand, because all understandings come naturally when you climb the scale and get back to the natural self, because it's already in knowingness. The natural self is a reflection of the higher mind, or the higher self. It's the spirit that you took with you into this life, which is part of the higher mind, or the full self, or the higher self. So it doesn't really need to learn anything. It's already in complete knowingness. It's just the life or the spiritual journey is about discovering your natural self or your true self from a different point of view, from a different journey each time. So that's how it works. That's why when you have resistance to the natural self will filter through all these resistances and negative beliefs, and that creates friction, which creates suffering, which eventually can lead to all sorts of diseases and ailments in the long run, and sometimes in the short run. So that's pretty much how it works. So you can look at yourself that you're filled with resistances. No matter what belief system you're holding on to, it's still a kind of resistance. And the natural self don't need any belief systems, not spirituality, nothing. So when you have that understanding, you begin to get a bigger picture of what these concepts mean and how you can apply them. And it basically means that everything you think about as you is actually a resistance to the natural self. That can sound crazy at first, but it makes sense if you look at it. And it's definitely my conclusion from my experience. That's the case. That's the truth. You have to deconstruct yourself, and that can be really painful. It can be really difficult because you have to look at all sorts of stuff that you wouldn't want to admit about yourself, maybe, and you have to be really honest with yourself and not be afraid of admitting and things that you have buried in yourself that you don't want to look at, maybe don't want to admit, but that's the only way to get to freedom. And we are getting there on a collective level too. We're not only dismantling our own inner Antichrist, inner Lucifer, but we are also dismantling the mass consciousness and the mass the collective negative ego, the collective Lucifer. So this is the whole operation we are part of. We are doing our little part of every day by doing this work, inner work. And so it's going to be a incredible freedom, not only when you yourself find back to your natural self, but when the whole mass consciousness is liberated, which is going to happen within our time and hopefully in the not too distant future. It's going to be a level of freedom that you can't even imagine at this point. It's going to be so different from what we have now. We are facing off, many people are now facing off against their inner Lucifer, which is coming up in everybody, or many people these days, I observe. And at the same time, the collective Lucifer is also being challenged and being dismantled on a mass scale with all the craziness going on, which is why it's lashing out and going crazy and using all sorts of avenues it might have through people and whatnot to lash out and create as much negativity and craziness as possible. That's the end time madness we see all around us these days. But it's going to pass. The dark night of the soul does not last forever. It's a passing phase, and something completely new will be birthed out of this death throes of the old.